Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're exploring one of the most fascinating and overlooked aspects of human history, the way our ancestors actually slept. For most of human existence, people didn't sleep through the night in one continuous block as we do today. Instead, they practiced what historians call segmented sleep or biphasic sleep, dividing their nighttime rest into two distinct periods separated by an hour or more of quiet wakefulness. This wasn't insomnia or a sleep disorder. It was the normal, natural pattern of sleep that dominated human experience for millennia, appearing in historical records, literature, medical texts, and personal accounts across cultures and continents. Understanding why people slept this way, what they did during their nighttime wakeful periods, and why this pattern disappeared reveals much about human biology, social history, and the profound changes that industrialization brought to even the most intimate aspects of human existence. Before we begin this journey through the history of human sleep, if you find this exploration valuable, consider subscribing to support more content like this. And please share in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever experienced waking naturally in the middle of the night and feeling peacefully alert. Now, settle in comfortably as we explore the lost world of segmented sleep and discover why our ancestors' nights were very different from our own. The modern rediscovery of segmented sleep as a historical norm rather than an aberration came relatively recently, primarily through the work of historian Roger Kirsch. His groundbreaking research in the 1990s and early 2000s uncovered thousands of references to divided sleep patterns in historical documents spanning centuries and continents. Kirk was researching his book on nighttime in pre-industrial societies when he began noticing curious references in diaries, court documents, medical texts, and literature. People wrote about first sleep and second sleep as if these were completely ordinary, universally understood concepts requiring no explanation. In legal depositions, witnesses would specify whether events occurred before or after first sleep, using these time markers as casually as we might reference morning or afternoon. Medical manuals gave advice about the optimal activities during the interval between sleeps. Prayer books contained special prayers designated for the nighttime waking period. The references appeared across social classes and geographical regions. Peasants and aristocrats, English and French, Italians and Scandinavians, all seemed to share this pattern of divided sleep. The ubiquity of these references suggested something remarkable. What we consider the normal way to sleep, one consolidated block of 7 to 8 hours, is actually a modern innovation. Before artificial lighting became widespread, and before industrial work schedules demanded strict timekeeping, people went to bed relatively soon after darkness fell, typically between 9 and 10 p.m. This first sleep, sometimes called dead sleep or beauty sleep, lasted approximately 4 hours. Around midnight or 1 a.m., people would wake naturally. This wasn't a groggy, disoriented waking, but rather a peaceful transition to quiet alertness. They remained in bed or got up for an hour or two, engaging in various activities we'll explore in detail shortly, before returning to their second sleep that would last until dawn. The historical evidence for this pattern is extensive and compelling. A French doctor's manual from the 16th century advised couples that the best time for conception was between first and second sleep, when partners had rested and were more relaxed. This recommendation assumes the reader would immediately understand the reference to divided sleep periods. English ballads and poems referenced first sleep without explanation, indicating the audience's familiarity with the concept. Legal documents from various European courts noted events occurring 2 hours before first sleep, or after second sleep had begun, using these markers to establish timelines. Diaries and personal letters mentioned activities during the wakeful interval: reading, praying, conversing with bed partners, checking on household security, tending fires, or simply lying in peaceful contemplation. The casual tone of these references indicates that writers assumed their readers would find nothing unusual about nighttime wakefulness. The pattern wasn't limited to Europe. Evidence suggests similar sleep patterns existed in other cultures, though the documentation is less extensive. The prevalence across different societies suggests that segmented sleep might have been a nearly universal human pattern in pre-industrial times. The medical understanding of sleep in earlier eras also reflected this divided pattern. Physicians wrote about the different qualities of first and second sleep, attributing different restorative properties to each period. First sleep was considered deeper and more physically restorative. It should be deep, undisturbed, and sufficient in duration. The quality of first sleep was thought to affect overall health significantly. Second sleep was characterized differently: lighter, more subject to dreams, still restorative but in different ways. Some texts suggested second sleep was particularly important for mental and emotional health, while first sleep was more crucial for physical restoration. This medical framework assumed divided sleep as the baseline human pattern, with continuous sleep sometimes mentioned as an aberration, or as something that happened occasionally but wasn't the norm. The interval between sleeps received specific medical attention. Physicians recommended various activities as healthy or unhealthy during this time. The medical consensus seemed to favour quiet, peaceful activities, prayer, gentle conversation, light physical activity, over vigorous or stimulating actions. Sexual activity during the interval was discussed in medical texts, with some physicians recommending this timing as optimal for health reasons and for conception. The recommendations weren't purely mechanical but reflected a holistic understanding of how rest, intimacy, and procreation interrelated. The disappearance of references to segmented sleep in historical documents provides important clues about when and why the pattern changed. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, mentions of first sleep and second sleep had largely vanished from common usage. The terms disappeared from medical texts, stopped appearing in literature, and faded from everyday language. This timing corresponds with the spread of artificial lighting and the standardization of industrial work schedules, suggesting a connection we'll explore in depth later. The rapidity of the change is striking. Within a few generations, a sleep pattern that had dominated human experience for millennia disappeared so completely that its very existence was forgotten. The rediscovery of segmented sleep challenged assumptions about what constitutes normal human sleep. Sleep researchers had long known that some people experience sleep maintenance insomnia, waking in the middle of the night and struggling to return to sleep. The historical evidence suggested that perhaps this wasn't always a disorder, but might reflect an ancient pattern trying to express itself in a world no longer structured to accommodate it. The implications extended beyond historical curiosity. If segmented sleep was the natural human pattern for most of history, what did that mean for modern sleep advice that insisted on consolidated sleep? Were we fighting against our biology by expecting 8 hours of uninterrupted rest? Understanding segmented sleep required looking at multiple types of evidence. The historical documents provided cultural and social evidence. But what about the biological basis? Did human sleep architecture naturally favour a divided pattern? Laboratory studies in the 1990s provided intriguing support for the historical findings. When researchers placed subjects in conditions mimicking pre-industrial light exposure, darkness for 14 hours per night, participants spontaneously developed a biphasic sleep pattern after several weeks of adjustment. Subjects would sleep for approximately 4 hours, wake for 1 to 2 hours in a state of quiet rest characterized by elevated levels of prolactin, a hormone associated with relaxation and calm, then return to sleep for another 4 hours. This laboratory replication of the historical pattern suggested a biological basis for segmented sleep. The natural human sleep architecture, when freed from artificial light and social scheduling pressures, seemed to organize itself into 2 distinct periods separated by wakeful rest. This finding supported the historical evidence and suggested that segmented sleep wasn't just a cultural practice, but potentially reflected underlying human biology. The discovery of segmented sleep opened up new areas of historical investigation. If nighttime wakefulness was normal, what did people do during those hours? How did societies organize themselves around this pattern? What changed to make consolidated sleep the new norm? These questions led to examining nighttime activities in pre-industrial societies, the social structures that accommodated divided sleep, and the technological and economic changes that eventually eliminated this ancient pattern. The story of segmented sleep reveals how profoundly industrialization changed human life, reaching even into the most private and seemingly natural aspects of existence, the way we sleep. To understand why segmented sleep was the dominant pattern for most of human history, we must examine the biological mechanisms underlying human sleep and how they function in the absence of artificial influences that characterize modern life. Human sleep is governed by two primary processes: the homeostatic sleep drive and the circadian rhythm. The homeostatic drive represents the body's accumulated need for sleep. The longer you've been awake, the stronger the drive to sleep becomes. The circadian rhythm is the internal biological clock that regulates numerous physiological processes over approximately 24-hour cycles. These two systems interact to regulate when we feel sleepy and when we feel alert. In modern life, with artificial lighting and strict schedules, these systems are heavily influenced by external factors. But in pre-industrial conditions, they operated more in accordance with natural environmental cues. The primary environmental cue for circadian rhythms is light exposure. The human eye contains specialized photoreceptive cells that detect light levels and communicate this information to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, a tiny region of the brain that serves as the master circadian clock. In pre-industrial times, people's light exposure followed natural patterns. After sunset, the only light sources were fire, candles, or oil lamps, all significantly dimmer than modern electric lighting. This dramatic reduction in light exposure after dark sent strong signals to the circadian system that nighttime had arrived. The hormone melatonin plays a crucial role in this process. As light levels drop, the pineal gland begins secreting melatonin, which promotes sleepiness and helps initiate sleep. Melatonin levels remain elevated throughout the night and drop again as morning light exposure increases. In pre-industrial conditions with natural light cycles, melatonin secretion would begin as daylight faded, promoting sleepiness in the early evening. This accounts for the relatively early bedtimes documented in historical records. People felt genuinely sleepy shortly after darkness fell because their biology was responding to natural light cues. The homeostatic sleep drive would have accumulated throughout the waking day, making people ready for sleep by evening. Combined with the circadian signal for sleep and elevated melatonin, the conditions were optimal for falling asleep soon after dark. The first sleep period provided the deepest, most restorative sleep. The architecture of sleep typically follows a predictable pattern through the night, with different sleep stages occurring in characteristic sequences. Deep slow-wave sleep, the most physically restorative sleep stage, predominates in the early part of the night. During the first 4 hours of sleep, people would cycle through sleep stages multiple times, with substantial amounts of deep slow-wave sleep occurring during this period. This deep sleep is characterized by very slow brain waves, reduced metabolic activity, and significant physical restoration, including tissue repair and immune system strengthening. After approximately 4 hours of sleep, several biological factors would naturally promote a period of wakefulness. The initial homeostatic sleep drive would have been substantially satisfied by several hours of sleep. The accumulated sleep pressure that made falling asleep easy would have diminished significantly. Additionally, the human sleep cycle naturally includes periods of lighter sleep and brief wakings. In modern consolidated sleep, these brief wakings usually go unnoticed. We might shift position or momentarily surface toward consciousness before immediately returning to sleep. In pre-industrial conditions, one of these natural lightning periods, occurring after the deepest sleep need had been met, could extend into a fuller waking period. Without the strong homeostatic pressure for sleep that characterized the beginning of the night, and without the expectation that sleep should be consolidated, people could naturally transition into quiet wakefulness. The laboratory studies that replicated segmented sleep found that the interval between sleep periods was characterized by unusual hormonal conditions. Prolactin levels were significantly elevated during this wakeful period, much higher than typical daytime levels but lower than sleep levels. Prolactin is a hormone with multiple functions, but one of its effects is promoting a sense of calm relaxation. The elevated prolactin during the wakeful interval may have contributed to the peaceful, contemplative quality that characterized this time. People weren't restless or anxious about being awake. They felt calmly alert and relaxed. This hormonal state might explain the types of activities people engaged in during the interval, which tended to be quiet, contemplative, or intimate, rather than energetic or demanding. The biology seemed to support a particular kind of wakefulness, alert enough for thought and activity but not activated for vigorous action. After an hour or two, the circadian drive for sleep, which remained strong throughout the night, combined with renewed homeostatic sleep pressure, would promote a return to sleep. the second sleep period would have different characteristics than the first. Second sleep typically contained proportionally more REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement sleep, the stage associated with vivid dreaming, memory consolidation, and emotional processing. While first sleep was dominated by deep physical restoration, second sleep might have provided more cognitive and emotional benefits. The total sleep obtained across both periods, typically 7 to 8 hours, matched modern recommendations for total sleep duration. The difference was in the distribution, divided into 2 periods rather than consolidated into one block. The seasonal variations in daylight hours would have affected the segmented sleep pattern. In winter, with longer periods of darkness, the interval between sleeps might have been longer and total sleep time might have increased. In summer, with shorter nights, the pattern might have compressed or become less distinct. Human biology shows considerable flexibility in adapting to environmental conditions. The segmented sleep pattern likely varied somewhat by season, by individual differences, and by specific circumstances, but the basic framework of divided sleep seemed to be the baseline pattern when artificial scheduling pressures were absent. The sleep architecture naturally supported this pattern through the distribution of sleep stages, the timing of hormonal secretions, and the cycling of sleep drive and circadian rhythms. When people slept in alignment with these natural biological rhythms, segmented sleep emerged as the predominant pattern. Understanding the biological basis for segmented sleep helps explain why it was so widespread historically. This wasn't a cultural invention or arbitrary social practice, but rather a pattern that aligned with human sleep biology, operating under natural light conditions and without the time pressures of industrial society. The modern expectation of consolidated sleep requires overriding some natural biological tendencies. We use artificial lighting to delay melatonin secretion and stay awake later than natural darkness would dictate. We use alarm clocks to wake at scheduled times rather than when sleep has naturally completed. We expect sleep to be consolidated despite biological systems that might naturally organize it differently. This doesn't mean consolidated sleep is impossible or unhealthy. Human biology is adaptable, and people successfully sleep in consolidated blocks. But it does suggest that the difficulties some people experience with sleep maintenance, the tendency to wake in the middle of the night, might sometimes reflect natural biological patterns rather than pathology. The period of wakefulness between first and second sleep was not time spent restless and anxious about returning to sleep, as modern sleep advice might suggest. Instead, historical evidence reveals a rich variety of activities that people engaged in during this quiet hour or two in the middle of the night. Perhaps the most common activity was simple contemplation. People would remain in bed, in the dark or by dim firelight, and allow their minds to wander. This was a time for processing the day's events, planning for tomorrow, or simply existing in a state of calm awareness without the pressures and distractions of daytime. The quality of this nighttime contemplation was distinctive. The mind was rested from first sleep, but not yet dulled by the full weight of accumulated waking hours. The darkness and quietness provided freedom from visual and auditory distractions. The elevated prolactin levels created a sense of calm receptivity. Many people reported that this time was particularly conducive to creative thinking and problem-solving. Issues that seemed intractable during the day would clarify during the nighttime interval. Solutions to problems would emerge in the peaceful darkness. This wasn't the active, effortful thinking of daytime, but rather a more receptive, intuitive mental state. Prayer and spiritual reflection were extremely common activities during the interval. The Catholic Church actually had special prayers designated for nighttime waking. These prayers, called vigils or nocturnes, were part of the liturgical hours that structured daily spiritual practice. Monasteries and convents formalized this practice, with religious communities gathering for nighttime prayers between sleep periods. The practice was so embedded in religious life that prayer books for laypeople also included special nighttime prayers, assuming readers would be awake and prayerful in the middle of the night. The spiritual quality of this time was considered special. The darkness and silence, the separation from worldly concerns, the rested but peaceful mental state, all these created conditions favourable for spiritual contemplation and communion with the divine. Protestant traditions similarly acknowledged this wakeful period as particularly appropriate for religious devotion. Personal prayer, Scripture reading and meditation were recommended activities for the nighttime interval. Physical intimacy between bed partners was common during this time. Several historical sources, including medical texts, specifically recommended this interval as optimal for conception. Couples had rested from first sleep, shared the intimate quiet of the night, and were more relaxed than at the end of a long day. The recommendation wasn't just about timing for conception, but reflected a broader understanding that the interval between sleeps was a time of particular physical and emotional accessibility between partners. The quiet, private darkness provided space for intimate conversation and physical connection. Beyond the immediate physical aspects, the nighttime wakeful period allowed for conversation between couples that might not occur at other times. After the day's work and responsibilities, after first sleep had provided rest, partners could talk quietly in the darkness, sharing thoughts and feelings that the bustle of daytime didn't accommodate. Some people got up during the interval and engaged in light activities. Tending the fire was common. The fire that provided warmth through the night would need periodic attention. Adding logs, banking coals, ensuring the fire remained adequate but safe was a practical task that might be performed during the wakeful period. Checking on children or elderly family members was another practical activity. In homes where multiple generations shared living spaces, the nighttime interval provided an opportunity to ensure everyone was sleeping comfortably and safely. Security checks were common, particularly for households with livestock or valuable goods. A quick survey of doors and windows, listening for unusual sounds, or checking on animals might be performed during the wakeful period. Visiting the privy or chamber pot was a practical necessity that often occurred during the interval. Bladders naturally fill during the night, and the wakeful period provided a convenient opportunity to relieve oneself without interrupting sleep. Reading by candlelight or firelight was an activity for those who were literate and could afford the light source. The limited light available meant that reading was slow and focused, quite different from modern reading experiences. The text would be religious material, classical literature, or whatever books the household possessed. The quality of nighttime reading was distinctive. The dim light, the quiet, the particular mental state of the wakeful interval, all created conditions for deep, contemplative engagement with text. Readers reported that material read during this time seemed to penetrate more deeply and be better remembered. Writing was less common than reading due to the practical challenges of writing by dim light, but some people did compose letters, keep diaries, or write other material during the nighttime interval. Writers sometimes reported that the peaceful quiet produced better work than daytime writing sessions. Light household tasks that didn't require bright light might be performed. Mending clothing, preparing materials for the next day's work, organising items. These simple tasks could be accomplished by firelight during the wakeful period. Smoking tobacco became a common nighttime activity after tobacco was introduced to Europe. Pipes would be smoked quietly during the interval, sometimes accompanying conversation or contemplation. Eating light snacks was occasionally mentioned. A piece of bread, some cheese, a drink. These might be consumed during the wakeful period, though full meals were not typical. The eating was more about having something to do during the quiet hour than about addressing significant hunger. Listening to the sounds of the night was itself an activity. In rural areas, the sounds of animals, weather, and natural phenomena provided a soundscape quite different from daytime. Urban areas had their own nighttime sounds. Watchmen calling hours, occasional passers-by, the sounds of other households. This attentive listening wasn't passive, but rather an engaged awareness of the nighttime environment. People developed familiarity with the normal sounds of night, and could detect unusual sounds that might indicate problems requiring attention. Storytelling occurred between family members sharing sleeping spaces. Parents might tell stories to children who had also woken. Siblings might whisper together. The darkness and the particular receptive quality of the nighttime mental state made this storytelling time special and memorable. Planning and mental organisation for the coming day was common. Without the distractions of daytime, people could think through the next day's tasks, make mental plans, and prepare themselves for upcoming challenges. Worrying and anxiety certainly occurred during nighttime wakefulness, as they can at any time. However, the historical accounts suggest this was less predominant than in modern middle-of-the-night waking. The expectation that waking was normal, the absence of anxiety about lost sleep, and the peaceful hormonal state seemed to prevent the anxiety spiral that characterizes modern sleep maintenance difficulties. The social acceptance of nighttime waking was crucial to the character of this time. People didn't see the interval as a problem to be solved or as lost sleep to be mourned. It was simply part of the night structure, a normal phase to be accepted and perhaps even enjoyed. The activities engaged in during the interval reflected this acceptance. People didn't lie in bed desperately trying to force themselves back to sleep. They didn't worry about how tired they'd be the next day. They simply existed in the peaceful darkness, perhaps doing something quietly productive, perhaps simply being, until they naturally felt ready to return to second sleep. Understanding what people did during this wakeful period helps explain why the pattern persisted for so long. The interval wasn't wasted time or frustrating wakefulness, but rather served purposes that enriched life: spiritual contemplation, intimate connection, creative thinking, practical household management, and peaceful rest between sleep periods. The prevalence of segmented sleep in pre-industrial societies wasn't just an individual biological pattern, but was embedded in social structures, cultural practices, and shared understandings that accommodated and even celebrated the nighttime wakeful period. The language people used to discuss sleep reflected the segmented pattern. Terms like first sleep and second sleep appeared in multiple European languages, each with their own vernacular expressions for this divided pattern. In English, references to first sleep, first nap, morning sleep, and various other terms indicated the conceptual division of night rest into distinct periods. These weren't technical medical terms, but everyday language that ordinary people used in conversation and writing. French sources referenced premier sommeil and second sommeil with the same casual acceptance. Italian documents mentioned primo sonno. The linguistic evidence across languages suggested that segmented sleep was a shared European pattern, not limited to particular regions or cultures. The universality of the language, appearing in documents from different time periods, social classes and geographical regions, indicated how deeply embedded this pattern was in social consciousness. It wasn't something that needed explanation. Everyone understood what these terms meant. The legal system's use of sleep stages as time markers demonstrated how integrated segmented sleep was into social timekeeping. In an era before widespread clock ownership, people needed ways to reference time. The stages of sleep provided such markers. Court documents would record that an event occurred 2 hours before first sleep, or during the interval between sleeps, or after second sleep. These temporal markers were understood by judges, lawyers, witnesses, and anyone reading the documents. This legal usage reveals something important. The sleep pattern was so predictable and universal that it could serve as a reliable time reference. If someone said an event happened between first and second sleep, everyone understood that meant roughly between midnight and 2 a.m., though exact times would vary by season and individual. The standardization of time through mechanical clocks and later through industrial scheduling eventually replaced these biological time markers with abstract numbered hours. The transition from marking time by natural cycles to marking it by mechanical devices reflected broader changes in how societies organized themselves. Religious institutions incorporated segmented sleep into their practices and teachings. The Catholic Divine Office, the cycle of daily prayers that structured time for clergy and religious communities, included specific prayers for the middle of the night. Matins or vigils, prayed in the dead of night, were part of the monastic daily routine. Religious communities would rise from first sleep, gather for communal prayers, then return to their cells for second sleep. This wasn't seen as disrupting sleep, but rather as sanctifying the natural wakeful period. The practice extended beyond monasteries. Lay people were also encouraged to engage in prayer during nighttime waking. Prayer books included specific prayers for this time, and spiritual guidance often recommended using the peaceful nighttime interval for devotion. The theological understanding saw this time as particularly favourable for spiritual work. The darkness symbolised the soul's separation from worldly concerns. The quiet facilitated contemplation. The rested but receptive mental state allowed for deeper prayer and meditation. Some religious movements emphasised nighttime prayer particularly strongly. Pietist traditions encouraged believers to rise for nighttime devotions. Various mystical traditions saw the middle of the night as a time when the soul could more easily approach the divine. The social rituals around nighttime extended beyond religious practices. Nighttime visiting between households was a recognised practice. Neighbours might call on each other during their wakeful intervals, particularly in rural areas where houses were close together. These nighttime visits had their own character, different from daytime socialising. The darkness, the quiet, the small scale. These created intimacy and permitted conversations that might not occur during the bustle of daytime. Stories and folklore often featured events occurring in the middle of the night, during the interval between sleeps. Supernatural occurrences, significant dreams, portents, and omens were associated with this liminal time. The cultural understanding saw the nighttime wakeful period as special. Neither fully day nor fully night, neither waking nor sleeping, a threshold time when normal rules might not fully apply. This cultural frame gave the time a particular significance beyond its practical function. Courtship and romantic meetings sometimes occurred during the nighttime interval. In some rural traditions, young people would arrange to meet during this time, either within households or outside. The privacy of the night and the special quality of the time made it appropriate for romantic connection. The practice of bundling, where courting couples would lie together in bed while dressed and often with a physical barrier between them, sometimes occurred during this interval. This allowed for intimate conversation and connection while maintaining propriety. Household management tasks were sometimes deliberately planned for the wakeful interval. Brewers and bakers who needed to tend to fermentation or baking processes that required periodic attention might schedule their work to coincide with natural nighttime waking. The organisation of watch systems and security patrols in communities took advantage of natural wakefulness. Town watchmen would be active during the hours when many people were awake between sleeps, providing security during a time when legitimate activity might be occurring alongside potential criminal activity. The understanding of children's sleep also reflected the segmented pattern. Parents expected that children might wake during the night and would check on them during the wakeful interval. This parental nighttime vigilance was built into the structure of family life. Elderly people's sleep patterns, which often naturally become more fragmented, were less problematic in societies that didn't expect consolidated sleep. Older adults waking multiple times during the night were simply experiencing more pronounced versions of the pattern everyone shared. The sick and infirm required nighttime care, and the segmented sleep pattern facilitated this caregiving. Caregivers could provide attention during their natural wakeful interval without feeling they were losing significant sleep. The social acceptance of noise during the nighttime interval was different from modern expectations. While the night was certainly quieter than day, some level of activity during the wakeful period was normal and accepted. Households didn't expect absolute silence during these hours. The sound of someone tending a fire, moving about the house, or engaging in quiet conversation wouldn't be seen as disturbing. These were normal nighttime sounds that indicated people were experiencing the expected wakeful interval. The communal sleeping arrangements common in pre-industrial homes accommodated the segmented pattern. Multiple family members sharing sleeping spaces meant that nighttime waking was a shared experience. One person's waking didn't occur in isolation, but rather in the context of others similarly experiencing the interval. This communal aspect may have reinforced the pattern's social acceptance. When everyone in the household experienced similar nighttime rhythms, the pattern became normalized and unquestioned. The transition from segmented to consolidated sleep represented not just a change in individual behavior, but a transformation of social structures and cultural understanding. As we'll explore later, the shift required changes in how communities organized time, work, and social life. It couldn't happen in isolation, but required broader societal transformation. While segmented sleep appears to have been widespread throughout pre-industrial Europe and beyond, the specific practices and cultural frameworks surrounding this pattern varied by region, climate, and cultural tradition. Examining these variations provides a richer understanding of how the basic biological pattern manifested across different societies. In northern European regions with extreme seasonal variations in daylight, the segmented sleep pattern likely showed marked seasonal differences. During summer months with very short nights, the pattern might compress or become less distinct. Winter, with its long darkness, would create extended periods for segmented sleep. Scandinavian countries, with their dramatic seasonal light cycles, probably experienced significant variations. The long winter nights might have allowed for extended wakeful intervals, while the brief summer nights might have led to more consolidated sleep, or to different sleep patterns altogether. Historical sources from these regions are less detailed about sleep practices than sources from more temperate areas, but the seasonal variations in available daylight must have significantly affected sleep patterns. The cultural adaptations to extreme light cycles likely included flexibility in sleep timing and structure. Mediterranean regions, with their moderate climates and consistent daylight patterns, probably maintained more stable segmented sleep patterns year-round. The historical evidence from Italy, southern France, and Spain suggests that divided sleep was standard practice in these regions. The practice of the afternoon rest, or siesta, common in Mediterranean and Latin American cultures, represents another form of biphasic sleep, though divided by daylight rather than by nighttime waking. Some societies thus had multiple rest periods throughout the 24-hour cycle, reflecting adaptation to climate and cultural preferences. The relationship between nighttime segmented sleep and daytime rest periods is complex. In some contexts, they might occur together, nighttime divided sleep plus afternoon rest. In others, one pattern might predominate depending on season, work demands, and individual needs. British Isles documentation provides some of the most detailed evidence for segmented sleep, partly because of extensive historical record-keeping, and partly because historians have focused significantly on British materials. References appear in documents from Scotland, England, Wales, and Ireland. The terms used varied somewhat by region. Scottish sources might use different vernacular expressions than English sources, but the underlying pattern was consistent. Sleep divided into two periods with wakeful interval between them. Rural versus urban differences likely affected the pattern's expression. Rural communities, with less artificial light and work schedules tied to agricultural rhythms, probably maintained segmented sleep longer than urban areas where early industrialization and increased lighting began changing patterns sooner. French sources provide extensive evidence for premier sommeil and second sommeil across different regions of France. Medical texts, court documents, literature, and personal letters all reference the divided pattern as unremarkable fact. The French medical tradition, particularly in the 16th through 18th centuries, discussed segmented sleep extensively. Physicians wrote about the different qualities of the two sleep periods and gave advice about optimal activities during the wakeful interval. German-speaking regions similarly show evidence for the pattern. The terminology and specific practices varied, but the fundamental division of sleep appears consistent across different German states and principalities. Eastern European sources are less extensively researched in terms of sleep patterns, but available evidence suggests similar practices. The basic structure of pre-industrial life, darkness after sunset, limited artificial lighting, agricultural work schedules, would have created similar conditions supporting segmented sleep. Beyond Europe, evidence for sleep patterns in other regions is more fragmentary but suggestive. Reports from European travellers and colonizers sometimes noted sleep practices in the societies they encountered, though these accounts must be interpreted carefully given cultural biases and limited understanding. Some accounts from Africa suggest sleep patterns that included nighttime waking periods. The descriptions are often incomplete and filtered through European perspectives, but they hint at similar patterns in non-European societies. Reports from the Americas before and during early colonization occasionally mention nighttime practices that might reflect segmented sleep. Indigenous societies had their own sleep patterns adapted to their environments, and some accounts suggest nighttime wakeful periods were part of these patterns. Asian societies have less documentation about historical sleep patterns in languages accessible to European researchers, but the basic environmental conditions, pre-electric lighting, agricultural schedules, would have created similar pressures towards segmented sleep. Japanese historical sources apparently contain references to divided sleep periods, though the terminology and cultural framework differ from European contexts. The practice of nighttime meditation in Buddhist traditions might reflect accommodation of natural wakeful periods. Chinese historical documents similarly suggest awareness of nighttime wakeful periods, with traditional medicine recognizing different phases of nighttime rest. The framework of understanding differs from European models but seems to acknowledge that sleep naturally divides. The variation in cultural frameworks surrounding the same basic biological pattern is fascinating. While the fundamental experience, sleeping, waking, sleeping again, was similar, how different cultures understood, valued and utilized this pattern varied significantly. Some cultures emphasized the spiritual potential of nighttime waking. Others focused on practical activities. Some saw it primarily as private individual time. Others incorporated it into social and communal practices. These variations in cultural meaning occurred within the shared biological framework. The climate's influence on sleep patterns extended beyond just seasonal variations. Hot climates might make nighttime sleeping conditions more comfortable than daytime, affecting when and how people rested. Cold climates required adequate bedding and heating to make sleep comfortable, affecting household arrangements and practices. Humidity, altitude, and other environmental factors all influenced sleep quality and patterns. Communities adapted their practices to their specific environmental conditions while working within the underlying biological tendencies. Religious traditions beyond Christianity also incorporated nighttime practices that might reflect or accommodate segmented sleep. Islamic traditions include night prayers, with the tahajjud prayer specifically performed during the later part of the night. This practice might reflect accommodation of natural wakeful periods. Jewish traditions include nighttime prayers and study, with some mystical traditions emphasizing the special spiritual quality of the midnight hour. These practices might similarly reflect working with natural sleep rhythms rather than against them. The social organization of nighttime in different cultures varied. Some societies had more communal nighttime practices, with neighbours and community members interacting during wakeful periods. Others emphasized individual or family-level activities during the night. The extent to which nighttime mobility occurred, people moving between households, travelling, or engaging in activities outside their homes, varied by culture, climate, and community organisation. These differences affected how the wakeful interval was experienced and utilised. Understanding these regional and cultural variations reveals that while segmented sleep seems to have been a widespread human pattern, its specific expression was shaped by local conditions, cultural values, and social organisation. The basic biology manifested through diverse cultural forms, creating rich variation within a shared fundamental pattern. The transformation from segmented to consolidated sleep corresponds closely with the spread of artificial lighting, suggesting that changing light exposure played a crucial role in altering human sleep patterns. Understanding this relationship requires examining how different types of lighting affected behaviour and biology. Pre-industrial lighting sources were limited and relatively dim. Firelight from hearths provided the primary source of evening illumination in most homes. This light was warm-coloured, flickering, and limited in its reach, bright near the fire but dropping off quickly with distance. Candles made from tallow or beeswax provided portable light but were expensive relative to household budgets. Most families used candles sparingly, lighting them only when necessary and extinguishing them to conserve resources. Beeswax candles, which burned cleaner and brighter than tallow, were luxury items beyond most people's means. Oil lamps burning animal or vegetable oils provided another lighting option. These varied in quality and expense, with better oils and lamp designs producing more light and less smoke and odour. But even the best oil lamps were dim by modern standards. The key characteristic of all these pre-industrial light sources was their limited intensity. The brightest candlelit room was still quite dark compared to modern electric lighting. This dimness had biological consequences. Human circadian systems respond to light intensity, with brighter light having stronger effects on circadian timing. The dim lighting of pre-industrial evenings provided some light exposure, but not enough to significantly suppress melatonin production, or strongly shift circadian phase. This meant that as natural daylight faded, the relatively weak artificial light available didn't prevent the biological transitions towards sleep. Melatonin began rising, the circadian system recognized evening had arrived, and sleepiness naturally increased despite the presence of fire or candlelight. The limited availability and expense of artificial light also shaped behaviour. Families couldn't afford to burn candles or oil lamps throughout the evening for no productive purpose. Light was conserved, used when needed for specific tasks, then extinguished. This practical economy of light meant that evenings were darker than modern experience. Activities that required good light occurred during daylight hours when possible. Evening activities shifted toward things that could be done by limited firelight: conversation, light handwork, quiet socialising. The natural consequence was that people became ready for sleep relatively early in the evening. By 9 or 10 p.m., several hours after sunset, the combination of biological sleepiness and the practical difficulty of staying active in darkness made bed appealing. The first significant change in artificial lighting came with improved oil lamps in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Innovations in lamp design, particularly the argon lamp invented in 1780, produced brighter, cleaner-burning light than earlier lamps. These improved lamps began appearing in middle-class and wealthy homes, extending the practical evening hours somewhat. However, they remained expensive and still produced light that was dim by modern standards. The biological impact was probably modest. Gas lighting represented a more significant change. Beginning in the early 19th century, gas lighting spread through major cities, initially for street lighting and gradually extending to businesses and wealthier homes. Gas lighting was brighter than oil lamps and could be centrally controlled, making it practical to light larger spaces. The increased brightness began to have more significant effects on evening behaviour and potentially on circadian systems. Street lighting from gas lamps transformed urban nighttime. Cities became safer and more navigable after dark. Businesses could operate later. Social activities could extend further into the evening. The rigid division between day and night began to blur in urban areas. However, gas lighting remained concentrated in cities and in wealthier homes. Rural areas and working-class households continued using traditional lighting sources well into the 19th century. The transition wasn't uniform or simultaneous across different populations. Electric lighting, developing in the late 19th century and spreading widely in the early 20th century, represented the transformative change that ultimately shifted sleep patterns decisively toward consolidation. Electric lighting was dramatically brighter than any previous artificial light source. It was cleaner, safer, more convenient, and eventually cheaper than oil or gas lighting. It could be easily controlled and could illuminate large spaces uniformly. The biological impact of electric lighting was profound. The bright light exposure in the evening hours before bed directly suppressed melatonin production. The circadian system, receiving signals that bright light was still present, delayed its evening transition towards sleep readiness. This meant that people could stay awake later without fighting their biology. Their biological systems were receiving signals that it was still daytime. The natural early sleepiness that characterized pre-industrial evenings diminished as people spent evenings in brightly lit environments. The consolidated sleep pattern emerged from this changed light environment. People went to bed later because they felt sleepy later. They slept through the night because they weren't going to bed shortly after dark with many hours of darkness remaining ahead. The biological window for segmented sleep closed. Going to bed at 11 p.m. or midnight and needing to wake at 6 or 7 a.m. for work left only 7 to 8 hours available for sleep. This matched the duration of consolidated sleep, but didn't allow for the extended time in bed that segmented sleep required. The combination of later bedtimes, scheduled wake times, and brighter evening light exposure eliminated the conditions that had supported segmented sleep. Within a generation or two, the pattern that had dominated human history disappeared from common experience. The speed of this transition was remarkable. Historical references to first sleep and second sleep remained common through the early 19th century, but had largely vanished by the early 20th century. The widespread adoption of electric lighting corresponded with the widespread abandonment of segmented sleep patterns. Regional and class differences in the transition reflected differences in access to electric lighting. Urban areas with early electrification shifted earlier than rural areas. Wealthy households with early electric lighting adopted consolidated sleep before working-class households still using oil lamps or candles. The cultural understanding of sleep shifted along with the behavioural change. Medical advice began emphasising the importance of consolidated sleep. The expectation developed that normal, healthy sleep should be uninterrupted. Middle-of-the-night waking, which had been normal, began to be pathologized as insomnia. This redefinition of normal sleep had lasting consequences. People who naturally woke during the night began to worry about their sleep. The anxiety about nighttime waking could itself prevent returning to sleep, creating genuine sleep problems from what had been normal patterns. Understanding the role of artificial lighting in transforming sleep patterns reveals how profoundly technology can alter even basic biological functions. The change wasn't just about having light available. It was about how that light affected biology, behaviour, schedules, and ultimately the structure of daily life. While artificial lighting provided the technological means for shifting sleep patterns, the Industrial Revolution provided the motivations and requirements that made consolidated sleep not just possible but necessary. Understanding the role of industrial scheduling helps explain why segmented sleep disappeared when it did. Pre-industrial work patterns were flexible and task-oriented rather than time-oriented. Agricultural work followed natural rhythms, planting and harvest seasons, daily animal care needs, weather conditions. The work had to be done, but within broad parameters, the exact timing was flexible. Artisans and craftspeople similarly worked in task-oriented patterns. A cobbler would complete the shoes that needed making, working longer some days and less on others, depending on demand, available materials and personal energy. The blacksmith's forge operated when work needed doing, not according to strict schedules. This flexibility accommodated segmented sleep naturally. If someone had a shortened night due to staying awake longer between sleeps, they could adjust the next day's work rhythm accordingly. If seasonal changes affected sleep timing, work schedules could flex to accommodate. The domestic economy, household production for family use rather than for market sale, operated with even more flexibility. Household tasks could be rearranged based on multiple factors including energy levels, weather, and available time. This pre-industrial time sense has been described as task orientation versus the time discipline that industrialization imposed. People thought in terms of tasks to be completed rather than hours to be worked. The question wasn't, what time is it, but rather what needs doing. Early industrial work maintained some of this flexibility. Domestic production systems, where workers performed manufacturing tasks in their homes and were paid by piece rather than by hour, allowed workers to maintain traditional time rhythms, including segmented sleep. The factory system changed everything. Factories required workers to be present simultaneously for coordinated production processes. Machinery ran on fixed schedules. Production processes had to be synchronized. This demanded that workers arrive at specific times and remain for predetermined periods. The imposition of factory time discipline met significant resistance from workers accustomed to flexibility. Early industrial managers complained that workers were unreliable, didn't arrive on time, took breaks whenever they felt like it, and generally didn't conform to the punctuality and regularity that factory production required. This resistance wasn't laziness or inability to work hard. Pre-industrial work was often physically demanding and required long hours during busy seasons. Rather, it reflected fundamentally different concepts of time and its relationship to work. The transformation required intensive efforts to reshape workers' relationship with time. Factory bells, whistles, and eventually time clocks imposed external time discipline. Penalties for lateness and rewards for punctuality created incentives for conformity. Schools began teaching time discipline to children, preparing the next generation for industrial work. This new time discipline had direct implications for sleep. Workers needed to arrive at the factory at specific times regardless of how their night had gone. An alarm clock, not natural waking, determined when sleep ended. The workday's length and timing were fixed by factory schedules, not by individual rhythms or needs. Segmented sleep became incompatible with this regime. If you went to bed shortly after dark and woke naturally after 4 hours, you might be awake for 2 hours in the middle of the night, then return to sleep. But when the alarm sounded for the early factory start, you might be deep in second sleep, disoriented and tired. The solution was to shift bedtime later, going to sleep at a time that would allow for approximately 8 hours before the required wake time. This meant staying awake later in the evening despite natural sleepiness and compressing nighttime rest into a single consolidated block that aligned with the industrial work schedule. The railroad system's expansion reinforced this time standardization. Railroad schedules required coordinated timekeeping across distances. Time zones standardized time within regions. Clocks became essential references for coordinating activities across space. This standardization of time extended beyond work to social life. Meeting times, entertainment schedules, social appointments all became more precisely timed and less flexible. The modern sense of time as abstract, measurable, and independent of tasks or natural rhythms became dominant. Sleep became fitted into this standardized time framework. The concept of 8 hours of sleep represented a quantified, measured approach to rest, that aligned with industrial time consciousness. Sleep became scheduled like work, with start times, durations, and end times determined by clock rather than by biological completion. The domestic reorganisation around industrial schedules affected entire families. When men went to factories, women's domestic work needed to align with men's schedules. Preparing breakfast before the early factory start, having dinner ready when workers returned. Children's schedules were shaped around school timing that prepared them for factory discipline. This household coordination required that family members operate on similar sleep schedules. The flexibility that had allowed individual family members to experience their own sleep rhythms gave way to household coordination around industrial time demands. The cultural messaging about sleep shifted to support these new patterns. Medical authorities began emphasizing the importance of consolidated sleep. Popular advice literature stressed regularity in sleep timing. The previous acceptance of nighttime waking disappeared, replaced by the expectation that waking during the night indicated problems. This cultural shift was necessary to support the behavioural changes required by industrialisation. People needed to believe that consolidated sleep was normal and healthy, that their previous patterns had been wrong or inferior, that the new regime represented progress and improvement. The class dimensions of this transition were significant. Factory workers, whose schedules were most rigidly controlled, had to adopt consolidated sleep most completely. Middle-class professionals with more schedule flexibility maintained more sleep variability longer. The wealthy, with the most control over their time, could preserve some flexibility longest. However, the general social pressure toward consolidated sleep affected all classes eventually. Even those with schedule flexibility operated within a broader society, organised around industrial time. Social events, business hours, municipal services, all increasingly operated on standardised schedules that assumed consolidated sleep patterns. The resistance to alarm clocks is worth noting. Early in the industrial era, many people struggled with alarm clocks, finding them jarring and unnatural. The mechanical device forcing waking regardless of sleep state violated every previous understanding of how sleep should end, naturally, when the body had completed its rest. Over time, resistance diminished as alarm clock use became normalised. People adapted to external wake signals, though the adaptation was behavioural rather than biological. The body didn't start naturally waking at alarm time, but rather learned to tolerate the imposed waking. Understanding the role of industrial time discipline in transforming sleep reveals that the change wasn't simply about lighting, or even about biology. It was about fundamental restructuring of how societies organised time, work, and daily life. Segmented sleep couldn't survive in a world where punctuality and scheduled coordination became paramount. The medical and scientific understanding of sleep evolved significantly over the centuries, reflecting, reinforcing, and sometimes challenging the changing patterns of how people actually slept. Examining this intellectual history provides another window into the transformation from segmented to consolidated sleep. Medieval and early modern European medical thought inherited frameworks from ancient Greek and Roman medicine, particularly Galenic theory. These frameworks understood sleep as necessary for health, involved in balancing bodily humours and providing restoration for the body and mind. The medical text from this period assumed segmented sleep as the normal pattern. Discussions of sleep's timing and quality reference first and second sleep without explaining the terms, indicating they were standard medical understanding as well as common practice. Physicians gave advice about optimizing each sleep period. First sleep was understood as particularly important for physical restoration. It should be deep, undisturbed, and sufficient in duration. The quality of first sleep was thought to affect overall health significantly. Second sleep was characterized differently. Lighter, more subject to dreams, still restorative but in different ways. Some texts suggested second sleep was particularly important for mental and emotional health, while first sleep was more crucial for physical restoration. The interval between sleeps received specific medical attention. Physicians recommended various activities as healthy or unhealthy during this time. The medical consensus seemed to favour quiet, peaceful activities, prayer, gentle conversation, light physical activity, over vigorous or stimulating actions. Sexual activity during the interval was discussed in medical texts, with some physicians recommending this timing as optimal for health reasons and for conception. The recommendations weren't purely mechanical, but reflected a holistic understanding of how rest, intimacy, and procreation interrelated. The advice about timing and activities during the wakeful interval assumed readers would experience this period regularly and wanted guidance about using it well. The medical framework treated segmented sleep as normal biological fact, not as a problem to be solved. As consolidated sleep became more common in the 19th century, medical understanding began shifting. The references to first and second sleep disappeared from medical texts. Sleep began being discussed as ideally consolidated, with nighttime waking increasingly characterized as problematic. The medicalization of nighttime waking as insomnia represented a significant shift. What had been normal, waking during the night, became pathologized as a disorder requiring treatment. Medical literature began describing middle-of-the-night waking as sleep maintenance insomnia, a condition that interfered with proper rest. This redefinition had consequences for patients who naturally woke during the night. Previously, they would have accepted this as normal and used the time peacefully. Now they learned from medical authorities that this waking indicated illness or disorder, creating anxiety that itself interfered with sleep. The treatments offered for insomnia reflected the assumption that consolidated sleep was both normal and necessary. Medications to induce continuous sleep, behavioral advice about maintaining sleep hygiene, and various therapeutic approaches all aimed at eliminating nighttime waking. The development of sleep research as a scientific field in the 20th century occurred entirely after the transition to consolidated sleep. Early sleep researchers studied sleep architecture, stages, and functions in subjects who expected and practiced consolidated sleep. The research naturally assumed this pattern was the human norm. The discovery of different sleep stages, REM sleep, and the cycling of sleep stages through the night provided valuable insights into sleep biology. However, all this research occurred within populations practicing consolidated sleep, and didn't question whether this pattern was the only or optimal human sleep organization. The research findings about sleep stages and cycles were interpreted within the framework of consolidated sleep. The approximately 90-minute sleep cycles, the distribution of deep sleep early in the night and REM sleep later, the importance of uninterrupted sleep. All these findings described how consolidated sleep functioned. These findings weren't wrong, but they were specific to consolidated sleep patterns. They didn't address whether human sleep might organize itself differently under different conditions, because the question wasn't asked. When researchers in the 1990s conducted the experiment that replicated segmented sleep, placing subjects in conditions mimicking pre-industrial light exposure, it was largely by accident. The study was investigating light's effects on sleep, not intentionally trying to recreate historical sleep patterns. The finding that subjects spontaneously developed biphasic sleep after adjusting to natural light cycles was surprising to the researchers. It challenged assumptions about normal sleep organization and suggested that consolidated sleep might be an adaptation to modern conditions rather than an inherent biological pattern. The elevated prolactin levels during the wakeful interval between sleep periods were particularly interesting. Prolactin is associated with relaxation and calm, suggesting this wakeful period had distinctive biological characteristics. It wasn't the same as daytime wakefulness, but rather a unique physiological state. This finding helped explain the peaceful, contemplative quality that historical sources attributed to the nighttime wakeful interval. The biology supported a particular kind of consciousness during this time, alert enough for awareness and activity but calm and relaxed rather than activated. The subsequent research into biphasic sleep and its potential health implications has been limited, partly because the topic doesn't fit neatly into medical frameworks organized around pathology and treatment. If segmented sleep is a natural pattern rather than a disorder, what implications does that have for sleep medicine? Some researchers have suggested that middle-of-the-night waking, at least in some cases, might represent the segmented sleep pattern trying to express itself despite modern light exposure and scheduling pressures. The anxiety about waking might itself be the main problem, rather than the waking itself. This perspective suggests different approaches to managing nighttime waking. Rather than immediately seeking to eliminate waking through medication or behavioral treatments, people might benefit from accepting the waking period, using the time peacefully, and allowing natural return to sleep. This approach contradicts standard sleep hygiene advice, which typically recommends that people who wake during the night should get out of bed, and engage in activity until sleepy again, rather than lying in bed awake. The historical evidence suggests that lying quietly in bed during the wakeful interval was exactly what people did naturally. The tension between modern sleep advice and historical practice reflects the challenge of applying knowledge gained from studying consolidated sleep to situations where different patterns might be trying to emerge. The research into polyphasic sleep, more than 2 sleep periods per day, has similarly revealed human flexibility in sleep organisation. While not directly related to nighttime segmented sleep, it demonstrates that human sleep can organise itself in various patterns beyond the consolidated 8-hour block. The health implications of different sleep patterns remain debated. Some research suggests that consolidated sleep provides optimal restoration, while other studies find that biphasic patterns might have advantages for certain cognitive and emotional processes. The relationship between modern sleep disorders and historical sleep patterns deserves more investigation. How many people diagnosed with insomnia might be experiencing natural segmented sleep patterns? How many sleep difficulties arise from trying to force consolidated sleep when biology favours a different pattern? These questions don't have simple answers, and the research remains limited. However, the rediscovery of segmented sleep as a historical norm has opened new questions about what constitutes healthy human sleep, and whether modern sleep advice might benefit from incorporating historical perspectives. The experience of sleep, including the transition from segmented to consolidated patterns, varied significantly by economic class and social position. Understanding these class dimensions reveals that sleep was never simply a biological phenomenon, but was always embedded in social and economic structures. The sleeping arrangements of different classes affected how sleep patterns manifested. The wealthy had private bedrooms, or even separate sleeping chambers, providing quiet, controlled environments conducive to maintaining regular sleep patterns. The poor often slept in shared spaces with multiple family members, or even boarders sharing rooms or beds. The lack of privacy and the disturbances from others affected sleep quality and patterns. Maintaining a regular segmented sleep pattern was more challenging when sleeping conditions were crowded and unpredictable. Rural agricultural workers, who made up the majority of the population through most of history, experienced sleep patterns closely tied to agricultural rhythms. During planting and harvest seasons, work demands might extend far into evening or begin before dawn, compressing sleep time and potentially disrupting segmented patterns. During slower agricultural seasons, the longer nights and reduced work demands might allow for more pronounced segmented sleep with longer wakeful intervals. The seasonal flexibility of agricultural work accommodated these variations in sleep patterns. Urban artisans and craftspeople had different sleep pressures. Their work was less seasonal than agricultural labour, but was still task-oriented rather than time-disciplined. They could maintain segmented sleep while adjusting work schedules around their rest patterns to some extent. Merchants and traders, whose work required coordinating with others and responding to market opportunities, faced more schedule pressures than independent artisans. The need to be available during market hours and to coordinate with business partners created more rigid daily structures. Domestic servants experienced sleep patterns shaped by their employers' schedules and demands. Required to be available when needed, servants' sleep might be interrupted by household needs. The segmented pattern might provide some structure, but the demands of service created unpredictability. The wealthy classes had the most control over their sleep schedules and conditions. They could afford comfortable beds, adequate heating, private rooms, and quality bedding that promoted good sleep. They weren't constrained by rigid work schedules and could organise their days around their sleep needs and preferences. This class privilege extended to the transition toward consolidated sleep. The wealthy had access to better artificial lighting earlier, allowing them to extend evening activities. They could afford to purchase alarm clocks and timepieces. They had more flexibility in adopting new sleep patterns without immediate economic pressure. Paradoxically, the working classes, who had less control over their time, were forced to adopt consolidated sleep more rapidly and completely than the wealthy. Factory work's rigid schedules, the inability to adjust work timing to accommodate sleep variations, and the lack of flexibility forced rapid adaptation to industrial time discipline. The urban poor in industrial cities experienced particularly difficult sleep conditions. Overcrowded tenements, noise, inadequate heating or ventilation, and the presence of vermin all interfered with sleep quality. The The conditions were so poor that maintaining any regular sleep pattern was challenging. The night shift workers who emerged with industrial production faced unique sleep challenges. Required to sleep during daytime when their biology prompted wakefulness, and to work during night when their biology demanded sleep, these workers struggled with sleep quality and health consequences. Night work represented complete disruption of natural circadian rhythms and any semblance of segmented sleep. The biological and social challenges faced by night workers highlighted how much the consolidated sleep pattern depended on alignment with darkness during sleep hours. The gender dimensions of sleep also reflected social and economic structures. Women's domestic responsibilities often required flexibility in sleep timing, caring for infants who woke during the night, tending sick family members, and performing household tasks that needed attention at various times all affected women's sleep. The segmented sleep pattern might have accommodated these nighttime responsibilities more easily than consolidated sleep did. Waking naturally during the interval allowed for checking on children, tending fires, or performing other needful tasks without feeling that sleep was being interrupted. As consolidated sleep became the norm, women's interrupted sleep began to be seen as problematic rather than as a normal adaptation to domestic responsibilities. The expectation that everyone should sleep in consolidated blocks created tensions with the realities of childcare and household management. Elderly people and those with health conditions that affected sleep faced different challenges. The natural changes in sleep architecture with aging often produce more fragmented sleep. In societies that accepted segmented sleep, age-related sleep changes were less problematic. As consolidated sleep became the expected norm, elderly people's fragmented sleep was increasingly medicalized as pathological, rather than understood as normal age-related change. The anxiety about poor sleep could worsen actual sleep quality. The economic value of sleep, the recognition that rest affected work capacity and productivity, became more explicit with industrialization. Factory owners and managers recognized that sleep-deprived workers were less productive and more prone to accidents. The ability to afford adequate sleep became a privilege marker. Those with economic security could ensure sufficient rest. Those living on the edge of subsistence might sacrifice sleep to work more hours, or to manage household duties, creating a sleep deficit with health consequences. The historical documentation of segmented sleep comes from diverse sources: diaries, medical texts, court records, and religious writings. But some of the most vivid and accessible evidence appears in literature, where writers included references to divided sleep as part of their narratives without explanation, assuming readers' familiarity with the pattern. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, contains references to sleep patterns that suggest segmented sleep. Characters wake during the night, engage in various activities, then return to sleep, with the narrative treating this as unremarkable. The casual nature of these references indicates that Chaucer expected his audience to understand divided sleep as normal. He didn't need to explain why characters were awake in the middle of the night. It was self-evident that people naturally woke after first sleep. William Shakespeare's plays include multiple references to nighttime waking that seem to reflect segmented sleep. In Henry IV, Part 2, a character speaks of being awake at the dead hour of the night, a phrase that might reference the interval between sleep periods. Other Shakespeare plays mention characters waking in the night, the hours after midnight, and nighttime activities that suggest wakefulness was expected rather than unusual. The plays weren't specifically about sleep patterns, so these references were incidental details that reflected contemporary experience. Homer's Odyssey, though much more ancient than the medieval and early modern sources, contains descriptions of nighttime waking and activity that some scholars interpret as possibly referencing segmented sleep. The epic describes Odysseus waking during the night and lying in thought before returning to sleep. While interpreting ancient text requires caution, the descriptions do suggest that prolonged nighttime wakefulness was part of the epic's world and wouldn't have seemed strange to its audiences. The medieval epic Beowulf includes nighttime scenes where characters are awake during hours we might expect them to be sleeping. While the context is often dramatic, preparing for battle or keeping watch, the narrative doesn't treat nighttime wakefulness as unusual. French literature of the 16th through 18th centuries contains explicit references to premier sommeil and second sommeil. These references appear in novels, plays, poetry, and other literary forms, always without explanation, indicating widespread audience familiarity. One French medical text from the 16th century advises that the interval between first and second sleep is the optimal time for conception, stating that both partners are rested and relaxed. This advice appears in the context of broader guidance about marital relations and family planning. English diaries from the 17th and 18th centuries frequently mention first sleep and second sleep. Samuel Pepys's detailed diary includes references to waking after first sleep, lying in thought or conversation with his wife, then returning to sleep. The casual tone of these diary entries indicates that Pepys didn't consider this pattern noteworthy. It was simply part of normal nightly experience. His diaries provide detailed evidence for how the nighttime interval was actually used by one well-documented individual. Court depositions and legal documents provide some of the most concrete evidence. Witnesses establishing timelines would specify that events occurred 2 hours before first sleep, or during the interval between first and second sleep, using these markers to place events in time. The legal system's acceptance of these temporal markers indicates how universal and predictable the pattern was. If sleep timing varied wildly between individuals, it couldn't serve as a reliable reference for establishing when events occurred. Religious texts and prayer books include prayers specifically designated for nighttime waking. Catholic books of hours included prayers for vigils, nighttime devotions during the wakeful interval between sleep periods. Protestant devotional literature similarly referenced nighttime prayer, assuming that readers would naturally be awake during certain nighttime hours and could use this time for spiritual practice. The transition period, when segmented sleep was disappearing but hadn't yet vanished entirely, produced some interesting literary evidence. Some late 19th and early 20th century sources mention older people or rural people maintaining old-fashioned sleep patterns, implicitly contrasting them with newer consolidated sleep. These transitional references provide evidence for the timing of the change and for the awareness that sleep patterns were shifting. The characterization of segmented sleep as old-fashioned or rural marked it as something passing away, being replaced by more modern patterns. By the mid-20th century, references to segmented sleep had almost entirely disappeared from literature. The pattern had been forgotten so completely that readers would have found references confusing rather than familiar. Modern readers encountering historical references to first sleep and second sleep often don't understand what these terms mean. The phrases have become mysterious rather than self-evident, requiring scholarly explanation and annotation. This complete erasure of cultural memory around segmented sleep within just a few generations is remarkable. A pattern that had been so universal and unremarkable that writers mentioned it without explanation became so forgotten that its very existence surprised modern researchers. The literary evidence, combined with other historical sources, provides overwhelming documentation that segmented sleep was the normal pattern for pre-industrial Europeans. The physical spaces where people slept and the architecture of homes were both shaped by and accommodated the segmented sleep pattern. In peasant and working-class homes, dedicated bedrooms were often absent. The main living space served multiple functions and was transformed into sleeping quarters at night. The lack of spatial separation meant that sleeping occurred in the same space as other nighttime activities. Wealthy households had more spatial differentiation, with dedicated sleeping chambers. The great bed in wealthy households was often curtained for warmth and privacy. The heating of sleeping spaces was a constant challenge. The need to tend fires during the night aligned with the wakeful interval of segmented sleep. Lighting within sleeping spaces during the wakeful interval was minimal, which contributed to the peaceful, contemplative quality of the interval. The transition from segmented to consolidated sleep occurred over several generations during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The spread of gas and electric lighting was the most visible technological change, but social, economic and cultural changes all contributed. The standardization of time through railroads created a world where clock time governed activity. When factory workers needed to arrive at specific times, businesses that served them also needed to operate on schedules. This schedule coordination pressured even those not directly involved in industrial work to adopt consolidated sleep. The cultural transformation was equally important. The emerging industrial culture valued efficiency and productivity. The medicalization of nighttime waking as insomnia was part of this cultural shift. People who woke during the night increasingly worried about their sleep, and this anxiety itself interfered with natural sleep patterns. The pharmaceutical industry's development of sleep medications both reflected and reinforced the expectation of consolidated sleep. The changing role of nighttime in social life also contributed to the transformation. Going to bed at 11 p.m. or midnight rather than at 9 or 10 p.m. left less time for sleep before morning obligations. The cultural memory of segmented sleep faded with remarkable speed. Within 2 or 3 generations, people had completely forgotten that sleep had ever been different. This forgetting was so complete that when historians began discovering historical references to segmented sleep, the findings surprised even experts. The consequences were multiple and complex. Consolidated sleep aligned well with industrial schedules, and people adapted successfully. However, the forced consolidation may have created problems for some people whose biology still favoured divided sleep. The loss of the nighttime wakeful interval eliminated a period that had served important functions: spiritual contemplation, intimate connection, creative thought, and peaceful rest. Some mental health professionals have suggested that the loss of this contemplative time might contribute to modern psychological challenges. The rediscovery of segmented sleep has prompted reconsideration of modern sleep problems and assumptions about what constitutes normal sleep. For individuals who experience sleep maintenance insomnia, the historical evidence offers a different framework for understanding their experience. Some sleep therapists have begun incorporating understanding of segmented sleep into their practice. However, even if someone's biology favours segmented sleep, practical constraints of modern life might make accommodating this pattern difficult. The workplace implications are significant. Some progressive workplaces have begun acknowledging sleep's importance to productivity. The educational implications are also noteworthy. School schedules, particularly for adolescents, often conflict with biological needs. The public health dimensions of sleep deserve greater attention. Sleep deprivation is widespread in modern industrial societies. The cultural conversation about rest, productivity, and work-life balance intersects with understandings of sleep. The historical understanding of segmented sleep doesn't provide simple prescriptions for modern life, but it does challenge assumptions about what constitutes normal human sleep. For thousands of years, humans slept in 2 shifts separated by a peaceful hour or 2 of quiet wakefulness. This wasn't a disorder, but the natural pattern that emerged when humans lived in alignment with darkness and natural cycles. The historical evidence is extensive and convincing. The biological research supports the historical evidence. The transformation from segmented to consolidated sleep occurred rapidly during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The disappearance was so complete that cultural memory was entirely erased. This demonstrates how profoundly social changes can transform even basic aspects of human experience. The implications for modern life are complex. Consolidated sleep works well for most people, but understanding that middle-of-the-night waking was once normal might help reduce anxiety for people who experience it. The loss of the contemplative wakeful interval might represent a genuine cost of modern life. The story of segmented sleep reveals deep interconnections between biology, environment, technology, social organization, and culture. Finding better approaches requires learning from history while recognizing we cannot simply recreate the past. The story is ultimately about what it means to be human, about how our most intimate experiences are shaped by the worlds we create, and about the possibility of organizing life differently in ways that might better support human flourishing. Our ancestors spent an hour or 2 each night in peaceful wakefulness, resting between sleeps. That this time existed for millennia and then disappeared within a few generations shows both how adaptable humans are and how profoundly our creations shape even the most seemingly natural aspects of our existence. Thank you for joining this exploration of why people slept in 2 shifts for centuries.